Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. A cursory glance at Gabby Petito's social media reveals the same thing on pretty much all social media. It's all smiles. It looks like a happy-go-lucky fairy tale between 22-year-old Gabby and her 23-year-old fiancé, Brian Laundrie. But if there was a motive, if something did happen, what was it? If you're unfamiliar with this channel, True Crime Rocket Science, I'm an author of over 100 true crime books, and I've covered at least half a dozen missing persons cases in a lot of detail, a lot of depth, including the Summer Wells case. The fact that the couple left together on July 2nd from New York, but then Brian arrived home in Florida without Gabby on September 1st, 2 months into what should have been a 4-month summer epic across the continent, and with no explanation about Gabby, says it all, doesn't it? Well, actually, it says very little. It doesn't say anything about the dynamic between the two. There's clearly a suggestion of foul play, and Brian's lawyering up leads one to believe that whatever has happened to Gabby is serious. But to know the motive here, if there is a motive, we have to do the most difficult work there is in true crime. We have to spend time getting to know the characters involved here. So let's do that. But before we get to that, if you haven't subscribed to the channel, please do. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So we'll start off with Gabby. The first thing to say is that the van was Gabby's. The social media account on YouTube, Nomadic Static, was Gabby's, and probably the idea of the cross-country trip was Gabby's as well. I could be wrong on the last point, but it does feel like the idea was hers as well. Now, I'm going to make an early call, and that is that the youthfulness of both Gabby and Brian are really important here, right? And, you know, often when we look into a case, we tend to see ourselves in the case. We don't see the individual. So we've got to push ourselves aside and let who these people are speak for themselves. Okay. So the one thing is that their youthfulness is going to be really important. So if you're going to put yourself in their shoes, put yourself in their shoes when you were 22 years old or 23 years old. And then the other thing is social media is going to be a massive driving force. Chances are perhaps you didn't have social media at that age, so you might not know to what extent it would have influenced the dynamics of this case. If you thought social media was a big deal with Shanann in the Watts case, and it was, multiplied by about 100 or 1,000, it's a very big deal in this case. Sometimes social media is sort of the lifeblood of certain young people. They can actually make a career out of it. They can make a life out of, their presence on social media. And sometimes it's a life in terms of a career, but it's also, and beyond their livelihood, it's also social status and, everything that goes along with that. Their status as a person, something that is different to what happened to a lot of us growing up. Going by Gabby's Instagram account, she looks to be a fresh-faced, attractive young woman and appeared to be reading Fight Club at the same time, at the time that the events were playing out. And so through this book, Fight Club, we kind of get an idea what they were thinking about, perhaps what they were talking about. And coincidentally, I actually watched Fight Club before I even found out about this case. Just the other day. It's a story about gaining and losing your identity. And in that sense, it exactly parallels the story of our two protagonists, at least in my view. Fight Club is also a story about gaining and losing your place in society, or social life versus social death. More on that in a moment. This is just my personal opinion, but in my opinion, and as a successful YouTuber, I found Gabby far more interesting and watchable than Brian. How about you? On her Instagram, Gabby uses her own name. In itself, that's a powerful indicator of claiming one's identity. She follows 240 people and has 271,000 followers, over 250,000. I don't know what that was like before this case went viral, but I presume it was already high. It would actually be good if there's anyone watching this video who was part of this case very early on, if they could answer that question. What was her Instagram like going through July and August? Her latest posts don't feature Brian at all, and he doesn't feature in her bio at all either. There's sort of a indirect reference to him where she says, traveling the world in our tiny van, right? That it's not all about her. In terms of her Instagram bio, she gives her name. She writes, along for the ride, traveling the world in our tiny van, art, yoga and veggies, hashtag van life, and then the YouTube link to the YouTube channel. And then the last few photos, let's say the last half dozen photos or so, all feature Gabby and none really feature Brian, which I think is quite interesting. I do wonder whether during their trip did Gabby find out to her surprise and her delight how popular she was, not only on her terms, but also compared to Brian. This was also likely a source of enmity between the two, the one gaining traction, social media influence, while the other did less so. How does that feel? How does it feel when you compare how you are gaining in popularity to someone else? Well, if you're not gaining as much as someone else, it feels like you are losing. It feels like you're a loser. So if that happened to you at that age, wouldn't you want to cut the trip short? Wouldn't you want to break off the engagement? Isn't that how Brian felt? Did Brian catch Gabby answering sort of flirtatious messages, or did he just come across flirtatious messages? And what about on the other side? Were they criticized as a couple on social media? How did they respond to that? Now we go on to Brian. Brian asked Gabby to marry him and not the other way around. I think that's quite important. And when you look at some of his comments, some of Brian's comments saying, my biggest fear is that one day I'll wake up and it will all have been a dream, because that is what every second has felt like since the moment we found each other. Till death do us part, or until I wake up, I'm so happy the answer was yes. Love you, honey. And you kind of get the feeling that he's really besotted with her. She likes him, even loves him, but he's very, very much more kind of desperately in love with her, right? And I think there's an additional reason why that love may be quite desperate and not just kind of sincere and beautiful. And we'll get to that in a moment. So if you bear in mind that they go into this trip engaged, and the engagement had been going on for about a year, they'd been dating about a year, the engagement would have made many of the tensions the two experienced on their dream trip more fraught than they would otherwise have been. So, for example, if someone is flirting with them on social media, it's going to be far worse if you're engaged than if you're not. Does that make sense? I think what sort of also set the cat between the pigeons was this YouTube channel that they started on August 19th. It's almost like a week later that everything changed. It feels that way, doesn't it? So the couple were dating since March 2019, got engaged in July 2020, and so they've essentially been engaged for just over a year. But they decided not to get married. It almost seems like they broke off the engagement ahead of their trip, apparently because they were too young. That's what Gabby's mother, Nicole Schmidt, told the Daily Mail. It was also Nicole who reported Gabby missing, called 911 and reported her missing, not anyone else, certainly not Brian. So if you think prior to the trip, especially since the pair were sort of childhood sweethearts, maybe not quite childhood sweethearts, but they'd known one another in high school in Suffolk County, New York, but they probably felt like equals at that point and equally accepted by society. But out there in the world and in the wild west of the real world, certainly the wild west of social media, and YouTube can really be the wild west, Brian may have discovered they weren't equal after all, not even close. And he may have felt that he's losing control of her, and she may have felt that she wanted to kind of let go, and she might have wanted to, spread her wings a little bit. If we take a look at Brian's Instagram account, he's following less than half the number Gabby's following, and has less than a third as many followers. Again, one would really want to know what was the status in August, in July, and even going back further than that, of their Instagram accounts. He also has far fewer posts, perhaps as a result of selective deletions over the past few days. Unlike Gabby, Brian's Instagram doesn't refer to his name, but the name of a possible design business. Was it successful? His Instagram also refers to Gabby's profile by name as well as the name of her project. So you kind of get the sense that he's living in her shadow, don't you? His bio reads, Brian Laundry, take a hike every day, bug bites are better than being brainwashed by the media, nature enthusiast, right? Taking on hashtag van life with @Gabs Petito, and then a link to nomadicstatic.com. So who is Brian? Well, he seems to be someone worried about being brainwashed by the media. Is he worried someone might be brainwashed by social media or by Gabby's social media? Like Gabby's final few posts, Brian's only include himself. Now let's deal with the really important dynamic here, which is Gabby and Brian. If we take the fabric of this case and the notion of Brian returning home with Gabby's vehicle, it could be a psychological match for this idea of Gabby's vehicle overtaking her vehicle in terms of status, social media status, in the sense of their respective identities on social media. We've heard stories of Gabby not wanting to let Brian into the vehicle and vice versa, and both of these are symbolic for the nomadic static hitting serious speed bumps, and one or both of the partners in the project no longer wanting to continue with the other. Instead of feeling encouraged and validated and enthusiastic, the experience has left them discouraged, invalidated and disheartened. The question is, which one more than the other? I wouldn't be surprised if it was Brian who felt more discouraged, more invalidated, more disheartened. Brian returning and not saying where Gabby is suggests that he's taken the social death quite badly, if that is what happened, especially if he imagined Gabby as part of his future, as it seems that he did, and then seen YouTube potentially steal her away. You may have seen how she is getting caught up in that whole thing, and how maybe he didn't see a place for him in that. By not revealing the truth about Gabby, Brian is potentially able to control the narrative. He may feel that he can control the narrative and steer his social credibility where he thinks it needs to go. The 2012 Ford Transit Connect van is sort of a proxy, in my view, for Gabby. So where Brian is still getting to go where he needs to go with Gabby, even if the events of the past few weeks have cast a dark cloud over him, even if Gabby isn't technically part of the journey anymore. Is the domestic disturbance of August 12th relevant? I think it likely preceded whatever eventually played out about 10 days to 2 weeks later. The question is, were the events already in play likely to get better or worse as time went by? So after August 12th, were things likely to improve or not? I also think the effective result of what happened there was that someone got away with something. I don't know who the perpetrator was on August 12th, but someone may have felt that they got away with whatever they got away with, that they could sort of talk themselves out of the whole thing. And maybe because nothing happened after that, they may have felt that would have just disappeared. And of course, when the case went viral, this came out as well. And that brings us to the fourth and final point, the social heuristic. Would this have turned into a nightmare if it wasn't set up first as a fairy tale? You know, this fairy tale of van life, this fairy tale of the couple, this fairy tale of these little journeys and experiences, and everything is wonderful. I've just come back from a trip I took my dog along, and I also put it on Instagram, some of it anyway. I put some shorts on YouTube, and some of it was certainly great and really nice, but there were definitely some unpleasant moments. I might talk about that in a live sometime over the weekend. Now, you might think about this social heuristic. You might think if a group of young people jump off a bridge, you might think that's a dumb thing to do, and that if someone is with them who doesn't really want to jump off the bridge but does it anyway, that is silly. It might be silly for you, but it might actually be a very wise choice. It might be an intelligent choice for that person, because at that age, the thing that you're preoccupied with, your job, is to gain social credibility, is to gain influence and relationships, to build relationships with your peers. It doesn't really matter how. And so there's a certain wisdom in achieving and maintaining a certain level of social status. It's important to have friends, especially at that age, to show social power, to show social influence, to make those connections, to be seen as fun by the same sex or the opposite sex or whoever you're attracted to. That's far more important than the activity that tests social power or the lack of. Social media can be a very difficult and dangerous bridge to jump off. In some cases, you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't. It's kind of like a rite of passage. So I think the answer, and I think coronavirus has sort of made social media even more of a kind of essential rite of passage. It's becoming a more likely way that people are finding to earn a living, to make a living, to test themselves, right, in the wild west of social media. I think the answer is that things got worse as the trip went on, don't you? One Instagram page took off a lot better than the other. And I don't think it's really a matter of, how many followers the one got. It is that one got more than the other. And so in that respect, the one is invalidated. So my own opinion is that Gabby, and maybe it's because I'm a guy, I think Gabby's a lot more attractive physically than Brian, and Brian may have been stung by what may have felt like unfair social media, just judging superficially, just judging from appearances, just judging, in that way, My first impression was that Brian was a lot older than Gabby. I was surprised to find out he's only a year older. He's 23, she's 22. But their relative youthfulness makes them both emotionally immature, reckless, I think, and impulsive. And I think those traits speak to this idea of the engagement, because the engagement is no more, certainly at this point. So I think the engagement was conducted perhaps in an emotionally immature way, reckless and impulsive, in a sense, and also charged with emotion, especially given where we are now. Now, you might disagree with me, and three of my best friends, male friends, all got married when they were 24, so it's not a lot older, right? On the other hand, whatever happened to Gabby was likely also emotionally immature, reckless and impulsive, but above all, charged with emotion. Do you agree with that? And particularly those destructive type emotions that are tied to identity and that sense of an identity impinged. Does that make sense? If you're not sure what I'm talking about, go and watch Fight Club and get a sense of what it feels like to have your identity removed, to have a sense of not being alive, to having a sense of not being valuable, not amounting to something, and then that changing, and then gaining credibility, gaining prestige, and then having that taken away again a second time. So that movie is quite a good illustration of that process. So I'm going to give you just a brief insight into something that I think is also relevant. I went bald at about 27 years of age, and I was quite shocked when it happened. It looks like Brian is going bald now at 23. And I can tell you it was a huge setback and a struggle for me in my late 20s. I was fairly mature. I still think I was quite immature in my late 20s, but I certainly would have been a lot less mature, earlier on, 22, 23. I was a triathlete at the time with long blonde hair, and a sort of a surfer hairstyle. So when I lost that long hair, it was quite a shock to me and to other people. So going bald is like being told your youth is over. That part of your life is over. It's not a pleasant sensation. And it's one thing for you to be told that or accept that, but what's it like when the people around you get that impression, including the people you want to be attracted, you want to, you want them to find you attractive, right? If Brian was feeling insecure about that while Gabby was superseding him on social media, one can imagine the bristling resentment. One can imagine the sensitivity that was increasing. Okay, so Gabby was last seen alive on August 24th, I think in the Grand Teton area, the national park in Wyoming. Text messages after Gabby's final FaceTime call with her mother, Nicole Schmidt, continued until August 30th. Brian arrived home the next day, that's on September 1st, at which point the text stopped. Gabby's mother believes the last week's worth of text messages were staged. It would actually be good to get hold of the last texts, from that whole last week. I think it would make symbolic sense, all of this, if they were staged, especially if Brian felt he'd been extinguished with a series of contrived online messages. Well, if someone harmed Gabby, he may have theorized she could be extinguished with a series of contrived messages too. In the same way that he was extinguished with a series of contrived messages, well, couldn't she be? And perhaps that was the motive, but perhaps that is the answer. And perhaps if someone did something to Gabby, he felt she deserved it. Symbolic payback for what he felt had been done to him. What do you think? Thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time.